Who's heard of Christopher Alexander? This is like 10x the response. I love that. So CA, Christopher Alexander, I've never shaken his hand, but I've been in a lecture of his at Berkeley. He lives in Berkeley and is a retired teacher. I think he might have died, though. Pretty sure he's dead now. Forgot to check before the talk. Sorry about that. And his field is architecture and urban design, so design of buildings and also urban spaces and so forth. And his heresy is, hey, occupants, the people who are going to be in those buildings, ought to participate in the design of those buildings and those spaces. And architects are like, no, this is for experts. You've got to have a degree and do whatever else. And he's like, nonsense. So he and a bunch of colleagues in the early 80s invent something called pattern languages. And a pattern language is a sequence of patterns that form up into a language to describe the distilled wisdom of that domain. And I'll give you an example in just a moment. But pattern languages are not rules. They're not, you must do this, you have to do this, always do this. They're just like, hey, if you want to create a living space that feels inviting, do this instead of that. And they work. They're really, really interesting. Again, there's a theme here. This takes thoughtful design. So when you learn what a pattern language is and how it works, you start to apply this in a thoughtful way. My favorite pattern, which I'll show you on the next page, is light on two sides. And this pattern language movement, here's a picture of the book, the famous book called A Pattern Language, that was published back in the early 80s, actually 1977, I think. I've met a couple of architects who said, oh, I love Christopher Alexander. My way of working with a new client is I hand them a copy of his book and I say, leaf through this. If you like this, we can work together. And I think that's really, really interesting, right? So the pattern language movement has spawned a bunch of other pattern languages. So I am friends with people who've created a pattern language for facilitating meetings, a pattern language for digital literacy and crap detection online, a pattern language for wise democracy. There's a fellow named Tom Atlee with a bunch of his colleagues created the wise democracy pattern language. You can Google it. It's fabulous. And so these are all people distilling wisdom from their domains and making it available to everybody else, but nobody knows about them. They're all hidden away, and part of my mission in life right now is to make them more available and more useful. So here's pattern number 159 of 253 patterns in that book. It's called Light on Two Sides of Every Room, and it says, when they have a choice, people will always gravitate to those rooms which have light on two sides and leave the rooms which are lit only from one side unused and empty. And so the next time you walk into a New York restaurant that's long and narrow and has only windows to the street, even though it's beautifully decorated inside, if it's daylight, there's a little piece of you that might be going, gosh, why does this not feel so welcoming? And there's another piece that'll be, that's because it violates light from two sides, right? So what's interesting about a well-written pattern language is that each pattern is sort of memorable. And so muggles, ordinary people, can actually participate at a much higher level than before because they'll be like, oh, let's move the room over here. Well, we could do that, except that would violate light from two sides. And the 253 patterns range from, the first patterns are about urban planning and land use. And the last pattern is make special niches just for children. And so they kind of intersect and there's dependencies between them. So one of the patterns might say this one touches these 5 patterns, et cetera, et cetera. It's like a little hypertexty kind of thing. But I think pattern languages are a general purpose way of communicating wisdom to make people smarter in anything.